To talk a little bit more about human trafficking, we're now joined by Dr Marcel van der Vat, who's worked with these issues for almost 2 decades as an ex-Hawks investigator, expert court witness and researcher. He's with the National Center on Sexual Exploitation in Washington, D.C. and remains active with these matters in South Africa and further afield on the continent. Founded in 1962, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation is the leading national non-partisan organization exposing the links between all forms of sexual exploitation, such as child sexual abuse, prostitution, sex trafficking, and the public health harms of pornography. Dr. van der Vat, thank you very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening to your viewers as well.
I don't think people in South Africa fully comprehend just how much trafficking happens in this country and beyond our borders. We often see posters on social media, this child has gone missing, and that's it really. Just how big of a problem is it?
Yeah, so Peter, not every child that goes missing is trafficked, right? But usually people who are trafficked are usually those adults or children that are missing. But I would argue it's been systemic in South Africa, on the continent, and in many countries for time immemorial. It's not like this problem suddenly surfaced when South Africa had got a new legislation. And if you think about what is happening in South Africa, the enormous levels of violence perpetrated against women, children, migrant communities, and just apathy and the globalization of indifference, all of these things are interspersed, and it really creates the ideal environment for people to be exploited, to be trafficked. And it is happening. It's alive and well in our country.
Perhaps maybe where we need to start is, what on earth is trafficking? What typically happens when our children are being trafficked?
Yeah, so Peter, there's a variety of forms of trafficking. I think what we most often see in South Africa and further afield is sex trafficking, where children are recruited and sexually exploited. That is happening. There's other forms of forced labor as another form of trafficking, criminal exploitation, children on the street being forced to manipulate it into begging, children running guns, children trafficking in drugs. There's a variety of forms of trafficking, but ultimately it's really that position of vulnerability that really is inherent to children that are exploited by third parties and ultimately by sex buyers as well when we speak about sex trafficking. A variety of forms in which this problem manifests itself.
All right, so here in South Africa, what is the most prevalent and who have you found to be the most culpable in terms of the traffickers? So,
again, when we think about what we are seeing in our courts, Peter, the overwhelming majority of human trafficking cases in our courts, including those with children, are sex trafficking cases where the purpose is to sexually exploit children. We have a large majority of local South Africans who are responsible as perpetrators, but also nationals from other countries who find themselves in the country. So it's so easy to create this stereotypical profile of a trafficker, but it's usually false because, traffickers don't self-identify, and they come in different shapes and sizes. And ultimately what we conveniently forget is that the people who purchase forced services, for lack of a better term, whether it's forced labor or commercial sex, are equally responsible as coexistence in this sexual exploitation or the forced labor exploitation continuum.
Some of these children, are they leaving the country and some are being trafficked within South Africa?
Yeah, well, the overwhelming majority of cases that we have is internal trafficking in the country. Peter, that's the large majority of the cases between our borders. And I listened to the comment of Minister Bheki Cele about being proactive on at the airports and ports of entry, but the overwhelming majority happens within and between provinces. The other thing is, transportation is not a necessity for trafficking to occur. Trafficking of a child can happen from one neighborhood to the other. Trafficking of a child can happen in one street. So that is why it's so important that we understand what child trafficking is, what the elements of the crime is, because we often have these preconceived ideas, which is really dislodged from reality. And therefore, the problem is far more prevalent and systemic, even beyond what available statistics are able to tell us.
So, what age groups are we talking about typically?
Yeah, so I mean, it happens in the spectrum of ages. I mean, we've had at least 4 successful prosecutions in South Africa where babies, are effectively trafficked, or with the intention to traffic children as young as 6 months to 2 years old, to children throughout their teens, young adults, and women, men in their 30s, 40s years of age. So there's not a typical victim of trafficking, so to speak. At the end of the day, vulnerability predisposes people, and whatever the value a trafficker or a sex buyer can find in a child or an adult, that is unfortunately where the exploitation and trafficking happens.
And then help us understand what then happens when a child has been taken. It sounds as if they are jailed or kept in some kind of captivity. Why is it difficult for them to escape?
Yeah, well, I think that's another preconceived idea which needs to be debunked, Peter, that rarely and infrequently do you have a scenario where a child and even an adult is kept captive between 4 walls. It definitely happens. But I mean, we often talk about psychological control mechanisms. There's obviously physical control mechanisms as well, where people are assaulted and raped, etc. But usually it's psychological control methods, people being threatened, people fearing their lives, should they even consider either the notion of reporting or disclosing, and then drugs plays a massive role in all of this, where an addiction is created, and that person, the child, the adult, becomes fundamentally reliant on the exploiter to provide that drug, to literally, in many ways, in many kind of scenarios, to stay alive and to be alleviated from, the crippling pain that's involved in drug withdrawal. So a variety of control methods that intersperse with trafficking.
There are parents watching, and maybe even young people, teens, and they might be asking the question, where am I most vulnerable? What should I be looking out for?
Well, I think, I would say, Peter, that, that safety starts in the home, and that mother-father relationships with children. If that parental figure are absent, that child will seek that figure outside on the street. So, we should also be careful not to demarcate the problem to a specific geographical area. I think, there's obviously, we need to take care in terms of where we frequent. We understand that crime, violence is of epic proportions in South Africa. So to surround ourselves with people that have our best interests at heart, be very careful about what's happening on social media. We know social media and technology, we always talk about the vice and the value of technology. Both are used by traffickers to recruit. So I think the key is to be able to identify what those indicators are when you are approached by a stranger. It could even be somebody that you know. And to really trust that intuition. We always use that example of, when a deer in the wild smell a lion, the deer doesn't negotiate. The deer runs away, and it's really to instill that peripheral visioning in our children, in adults, to really understand what the risks are around them. I do, however, caution against panic. Running away and being panicky about this issue is not helping anyone. I think it's really to be knowledgeable about the problem and how this problem manifests, and to take care not to fall prey to those who are really out to exploit.
As we're talking, I've got an image of young girls in my mind, but I'm probably I'm sure that boys are also being taken.
Absolutely. I mean, we have cases of forced labor. We have at least one or two, as far as I can remember, convictions in our courts where children are used as the domestic servants, but boys definitely. I mean, the overwhelming majority of our cases are girls and women, but we do know of cases on our courts where men and boys are victims to these crimes. Absolutely. And again, the golden thread is vulnerability, and vulnerability can come in various forms. I think we often think of vulnerability as somebody who has no means of physiological survival, but, I've worked with victims of trafficking over the years. One has been married to a policeman, the other one was a psychologist, so anybody can fall prey to this issue.
One also gets a sense that these operations likely are quite well run and are sophisticated at times, but also that they must get support from some authorities somewhere along the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Peter, I've written about the issue of corruption and human trafficking. I mean, I've been outspoken about that for many years. I've testified in a number of cases where corruption feature, and again, I mean, the organization and sophistication, it's on a spectrum, right? Many of these cases, you literally have one trafficker who's both the recruiter and the exploiter, and by implication, there's very little organization involved in a scenario like that. But you do get cases, and again, the recent cases where I've been involved with, where it's child trafficking and it's a syndicate that in excess of 25 role players, from recruiters, from funders, drug dealers, brothel owners. And yes, unfortunately, more often than not, corruption does play a role. Yeah.
Can society be more observant? Because I would imagine there are telltale signs, certain behaviors when some of these children are in public places with certain adults that just don't ring true somehow. Are there signs that we should be looking out for and be more aware of? Because we could be helping quite a deal if we just were more observant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Peter, I always say, on a cognitive level, if something or scenario playing out in front of you intuitively does not make sense, it's really to interrogate that, even if that means, first and foremost, not to put yourself in harm's way. Right. If there's harm or immediate danger, is to really phone the human trafficking hotline, and they're really good at mobilizing the right people, and we can give that the number out later. But I think it's, some of the telltale signs is usually, especially when we talk about children, is when there's an adult in the presence and the adult answers on behalf of the child. There's often non-verbal indicators, a lack of response to questions, being fearful, being clearly possibly intoxicated or under any form of dependence-producing substance. And, I mean, those are just some of it, and especially if there's no indication of an abode or a place where the child lives and is not able to clearly identify who the people are that is in his or her immediate surrounding. Those are definitely indicators that something is happening. Physical scarring, marks on the body, Those are all things that we should be looking out for. And if we do see those things happening in our midst, it's either to intervene personally, asking those questions, tell me, explain to me, describe to me what your situation is. If you are possibly in harm's way, is to call on authorities and mobilize others around you to intervene.
All right. Dr. Marcel van der Vaart, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very, very much indeed for joining us on the program today. Your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, so that's Dr. Marcel van der Vaart talking to us from Washington, D.C. With the sad reality that child trafficking in South Africa is happening, and often right under our noses in our neighborhoods. It's not something remote or far away, even though some are going beyond our borders. The majority of it is happening within our own country. So we need to try and be a bit more observant and just see what's happening around us. You could save a life.